Welcome back. Today I want to talk to you about Greek art. We're looking at a map of the ancient Greek civilization. You can see that it's centered around the Aegean Sea and then it's mostly composed of islands. Greece is situated between the Ionian Peninsula, which on your map is labeled Asia Minor, and the Balkan Peninsula, which is the everything south of the word Macedonia and includes the word Thessaly, that area which is now mostly modern Greece, but also some of the Balkan states. You can see that Greek culture is dispersed, and because of that, there is no single political entity in Greece. Greece is not like Egypt, which was largely a monolithic and singular culture. Politically, the Greeks were divided into what we call city-states. The most important city-state was the city-state of Athens, which you can see towards the center of that box, right at the end of the Attic Peninsula, a little spur off of the Balkan Peninsula. The two other major city-states were Sparta, and Sparta and Athens were often at war with each other, and also Delphi, and also Troy up in the upper right corner of Ionia. These are the major points of the major cities within the Greek culture, but among them there were different kinds of political entities. Some of them practiced tyranny, that is, they were ruled by a single person, a tyrant. Sometimes they practiced oligarchy, which is the rule of a select group of elites. And sometimes they were ruled by democracy, that is, the rule of the people. The word demos in Greek means people, and krasi, the suffix, means rule or power. All of these words, in fact, tyranny, oligarchy, democracy, words that we use every day to describe our own and other political systems, all come from ancient Greece. Ancient Greece has bequeathed many aspects of our modern Western civilization to us. So much of the things that we take for granted now actually have intellectual and historical roots that can be traced back to Greek culture. Each of these little city-states, by the way, is called a polis, P-O-L-I-S, which is the Greek word for city. So each city was its own little country, essentially. And the polis was the center of Greek life. This is also the origin of our word metropolis, which is a large city, and also the origin of our word police, the people who enforce the laws in a city. But despite all of this political and geographic diversity, the Greeks were united by a common tongue, a common language, and a common culture and a common religion. This is one of the functions, in fact, of the Olympic Games, which is yet another concept that we derive from the ancient Greeks, to celebrate their cultural unity every 4 years with athletic events, which took place on Mount Olympus. And you can see Olympia is there just to the left of the little box in the center of the map. Mount Olympus is believed to be the home of the ancient Greek gods, including the god Zeus and his wife Hera, and also the goddess Athena, the goddess of war and wisdom, and many others. So every 4 years, the Greeks would gather at Mount Olympus to compete in sports, and that was one way of celebrating and enforcing their shared culture despite their political and geographic differences. Today, though, I want mostly to talk to you about the development of a certain aspect of Greek art, which is sculpture. And furthermore, I want to talk to you about how this sculpture expresses the Greek idea of what we now call humanism. And that word if you're not familiar with it, is spelled Humanism. Humanism. Humanism expresses what we might consider to be a new interest or new focus on the human person, on the human spirit, and on the human body. And it recognizes that human beings have a unique place in the natural order, which is that we are aware of our humanity and aware of our rational capacities. We can look on ourselves and recognize ourselves as human beings in a way that, say, animals or plants do not look on themselves and recognize themselves to be animals and plants. Because of that, we also see that we have this unique capacity or power to govern ourselves. That's not the right word. What I mean to say is to direct our own destiny. We have this power to orient ourselves in history towards certain ends. And this awareness of human capacities, and especially human reason, is something that the Greeks really focus on. They really begin to understand and develop, especially in their philosophy. And one of the key people here, of course, is the ancient philosopher Plato, who spent most of his time in his thought asking questions about what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be a moral person, and how do we act? What separates a good man from a bad man? Many of Plato's ideas come from his own teacher, Socrates, whose philosophy is summed up in the Socratic dictum, or the Socratic command, so to speak, which is know thyself. So we should spend time reflecting on ourselves, thinking about who we are, and seeking to become the best versions of ourselves. This idea of self-knowledge is expressed very clearly in Greek art. But it didn't come out of nowhere, and it didn't happen immediately, which is why I'm showing you this early piece of Greek pottery called a funerary crater. A crater is a kind of Greek jar. This is a very large crater. Others are used for storing food or wine or oil. This is a very large one. You can see that it is 42 inches high, so it's about 3.5 feet high. And it's also, it says funerary, which means that it would be used for burying the dead. And it was found in a cemetery in Athens. And on the crater, you can see that there is a series of drawings or inscriptions which all show or depict a funeral procession. If you look in the upper register at the very center, you'll see that there's a body lying on a bier and being escorted or carried by a number of individuals. In the lower register, you see charioteers, probably also part of this funeral procession. And all of this indicates the importance or status of the individual. What's also interesting about this is that it's covered with geometric designs. In the very upper part of the jar, we see, in what we might call the lip, we see a kind of zigzag pattern that we call a Greek key. And you can see other geometric patterns over the surface of the vessel. The Greeks were preoccupied with geometry, and much of Plato's dialogues, actually his philosophy, considers the place and role of geometric knowledge. The Greeks did not invent geometry, but they certainly did more to develop the understanding of geometry than any other people. And it served in a very important place in their culture. The Greeks actually probably got geometry, the study of geometry, from the ancient Egyptians who had first developed it and then transmitted it to Greece, where the Greeks gave it further development. One more point about this vase is that Greek funeral rites, as we can see, and the way they buried their dead, is much simpler than what we see in ancient Egypt. In ancient Egypt, we see that the pharaohs were treated as gods, and they were entombed in these elaborate burials called pyramids. And here, the Greeks are giving much more simpler burials to their deceased. So there's a different kind of sense in the culture that we might look at as being much more egalitarian. There's much greater equality among people. There's not these great divergences between the pharaoh and the common people that we see in Egypt. There's not those same kinds of divergences in ancient Greece. The Greeks also developed a different sense of sculpture in their art, and this is what I mostly want to talk to you about in the rest of this video, is how this sculpture developed. What we're looking at here is some of the earliest, an example of some of the earliest kinds of Greek sculpture called kouroi, which is the plural. You can see that the title is the Metropolitan Kouros, which is called that because, as you can see at the very bottom, it comes from the Metropolitan Museum of New York. You can see that this is a life-size figure, or even a little over life-size. The completed height of the statue is about 6 feet 5 inches, but that would include the base. So it's about a 6-foot high figure. A kouros is a particular type of Greek sculpture which is significant, first of all, because it's entirely nude. And this is one of the Greeks' major innovations in art, the figure of the nude. And when we use the term nude, we're referring to a specific kind of treatment of the human body, which is that it is idealized. Here, the Greeks are celebrating the beauty and goodness of the human body in all of its resplendent nudity, just as it is. There's no shame in the body. There's no sense of covering it up. But there is a recognition of its intrinsic beauty. These kouroi figures were probably meant to represent ancestors, and so they're semi-divinized representations of the dead. What you see here is one of many statues that would have lined a processional way from the town or village up to the location of the temple where the people would have gathered to participate in various religious rites, including sacrificing an animal to the gods for their propitious treatment of them, to bless them and protect them, to give them food or whatever they need. Furthermore, these kouroi statues, are borrowed from the Egyptians. You can see that the kouros has the same stiff pose, arms straight at his side, and one leg slightly forward, just like we see here in the pose from Menkaure, from one of the pharaohs from the Great Pyramids at Giza. The pose is identical, and in many ways the treatment of the body is identical too. The handling of the anatomy is not as sophisticated as we will see in later Greek art, but it has the same kinds of beginnings. I'm going to go back here for a second. You can see also that many of these aspects are still very stylized. The Kuroi has very large eyes. His face, the treatment of his face is relatively anonymous, excuse me, not anomalous, anonymous. Uh, his hair is braided, but the braids aren't treated in a way that suggests to us a naturalistic rendering of braids, but is very abstracted. Even his anatomy, although I've pointed out to you that it is celebrating the human body, is still schematic, and the features, the anatomic features, are incised into the sculpture rather than fully brought out in the round. You can see what's different about the Kuroi from the Egyptian sculptures is, of course, their nudity. And this nudity applied in early Greek art only to depictions of men. There was a comparable kind of statuary that depicted women called Kore, which is the female version. And what we're looking at here is a Kore figure. And you can see that she's presented in a similar stiff pose, but her feet are side by side. She's not stepping forward. There's no action in the body. And she's also, more importantly, she's clothed, and she's wearing what we call a peplos, which is a kind of Greek, a kind of robe or garment, a dress that Greek women wore. In many ways, though, this Kore, which comes from around the same time as the first metropolitan kouros that I just showed you, has many of the same stylizing features. As Greek art develops, though, over the next century or so, and this is barely 100 years after the first kouros, you can see that there's already substantial development taking place. The figure is less stylized. The body is treated in a much more softer and more rounded look. The pose is the same, but the features of the face and the details of the anatomy are treated in a way that is much more naturalistic. And that's a key word. Naturalism means to convey things the way they appear to us in nature. What we see, though, is that this is all indicative of the Greek concern for humanism, their interest in the human body. I want to back up slightly because there's one other thing that I wanted to mention to you, which is that there's also a growing concern to give these figures a kind of expression, an emotional expression in their faces. The Egyptians presented their pharaohs with impassive faces, and that impassivity we might connect to their concern with the afterlife. They are conveying an emotion which they might sustain eternally, we might speak. Emotions, on the other hand, are passing. Our emotions change from moment to moment. And so to capture an emotion in a work of art is to capture something that is fleeting. And what we see here is that the Greeks are attempting to give the kouros figure a smile. His cheeks begin to lift up slightly, and we see the creases on either side of his mouth, all of which indicate that he is smiling. This smile is significant, though, because it shows that he is happy. It shows that he is satisfied. And what the Greeks wanted to convey was their satisfaction with themselves, that they are happy with themselves, that they are aware of their rational capacities, especially which they were exploring in philosophy, their ability to determine their destiny, their ability for self-determination, their ability to control their environment, all of which, in their minds, lifted them up and placed them at the pinnacle of the natural order. We see the same kind of smile on the figure of this Kore. It's a little abstract, but it's still there. This idea that the Greeks are trying to what we call the smile, I need to say, is called the archaic smile, because these examples come from the archaic period. There's a major shift in the development of Greek art around the 5th century BC when we enter the classical period. And what we're looking at here is a sculpture now called the Critias Boy, which is one of the first examples of classical art. You can see that even in its damaged state, it's still based off of the kouros figure. One leg is slightly in front of the other. There is the hint of a smile on his face. But in many respects, though, the trend towards naturalism and three-dimensional modeling has gone much further. We also see in this statue the beginnings of what we call contrapposto. That word is Contrapposto, contrapposto. Contrapposto is an Italian word that means counterpoised, and we use it in art history to describe a certain stance in the human body where the weight of one foot, where the body places its weight on one foot, which causes a series of shifts in the body where one hip goes up, and in this case, the figure is putting his weight on his left leg, which appears on the right side. And so his left hip is going up and his right hip goes down. And to counterbalance himself, to keep from falling over, his left shoulder drops and his right shoulder goes up. You can see this a little bit more clearly in the next slide where we're looking at it from the back. You can see that this is also causing the figure to twist. His torso is twisted slightly on his hips, which means that when the figure is in contrapposto, not only is the weight shifted in a two-dimensional plane, but also in a three-dimensional plane. It causes a spiraling motion to go through the human body. What this means is that the Greeks are increasingly interested in ways to bring their sculptures to life, to make them as lifelike as possible, to make them seem like living, breathing people. In fact, because of this concern for naturalism, the Greeks painted their sculptures, and what we see here is a reconstruction with the help of computer models of the way Greek statuary would have originally appeared. You can see, actually, if I back up, in the Critias Boy that his eyes are vacant. And the reason that his eyes are empty, those empty sockets, actually would have been filled with some other substance, probably glass, to make it seem like he had living eyes. But you can see here in this archer from the pediment of a temple that and this is the original here, you can see it's white, but archaeologists were able to find traces of pigment which allowed them to reconstruct the color scheme. The Greeks did not leave their sculptures white, but they wanted them to seem like living, breathing people. Fairly recently, archaeologists, and this goes back to the 70s, archaeologists discovered some bronze statuary from the classical period, which shows just how sophisticated this ancient Greek concern for naturalism was. And you can see here, first of all, a complete figure in the contrapposto pose. You can see how natural and relaxed he looks, especially compared to the early kouros figure. He is not stiff or rigid, but he has the sensation of being alive, of being relaxed, of being fully human. If we look carefully at his face, you can see that his lips are made out of copper and his eyes are inlaid and teeth are inlaid with silver so that they appear to be white. This statue was found at the bottom of the Adriatic Sea off the coast of Riace, Italy. And because of that, the bronze has patinaed, it's turned colors. But originally, and you can see here in the back view of the statue, some of the original color of the bronze, which would have had kind of a golden glow. So it would have appeared that his skin was kind of a golden bronze color, as if he had been out tanning in the sun. Furthermore, he would have been holding a spear. That's why his hand is up that way, and he has a small shield attached to his wrist, to his forearm. All of which is why we consider him to be a warrior. You can see the difference, though, that this kind of sculpture that the Greeks had developed during the classical period, how far it diverges from Egyptian art. The Greek bronze sculpture is naturalistic, it's humanistic, it's relaxed, as opposed to the stiffness and rigidity of the statue of Khafre, whereas the statue of Khafre is cubical and treats each side of the human figure as if it is a relief. It doesn't violate the block-like sculpture, the block-like space of the sculpture. The Greek sculpture is fully rounded. It has a sense of spiraling movement in space. There is no feeling for a cubic structure from which the statue was made. In fact, the fact that this statue was made out of bronze, the Riace bronze on the left, because it's made out of bronze, it allows the Greeks to create freestanding sculptures. The Egyptian sculptures are all bound by the stone from which they come. Think about the statue of Menkaure, which I showed you a few moments ago, where the stone fills in the gaps of the legs. Here, the statue is three-dimensional and fully released in space. He's not bound by any material. We might think about this as a metaphor for the fact that the Greeks saw human potential as unbounded by any natural or physical restraints. The Greek spirit, which this statue is meant to express, is unfettered. It is self-determining. It is humanistic. What makes bronze such a key medium for this is because it can be cast and it's hollow inside. And so the statue is sufficiently lightweight that you can create a sculpture that is freestanding. You could not do this with a stone statue, and here I show you some other sculptures that are stone, because the stone is too heavy. If you try to support the upper weight of the stone on just the supports offered by the feet of the sculpture, the feet of the statue, it would fall over. These two sculptures actually are Roman copies, and the one on the left is by the Greek sculptor Phidias, and it is an example of the statue he called his canon, and canon is a word that means rule. Phidias was considered to be the greatest of all the sculptures of classical Greece, and this was meant to embody his ideal of the human being, of the human body. It reflects also Greek interest in geometry, because the idea of a canon or a rule also means a measure, that the body has been carefully measured to present it in its most beautiful and ideal proportions. This, however, both of these statues, however, I should say, are Roman copies of Greek statues. These are not uh, made by the Greeks themselves. The Roman civilization, after they conquered Greece, widely admired their art and began producing copies of it that could be sold to collectors. The Romans, however, made their copies not in bronze but in marble, and marble, being a kind of stone, is much heavier than bronze. And so, because of the heaviness of the sculpture, of the material, the Roman sculptors had to uh, keep certain parts of the statue, which they've tried to somewhat cleverly hide, so that the canon at the left has a kind of tree trunk beside him, which actually sticks into his right leg. It enters his right thigh, uh, which is there to support it. It supplies a third support for the statue. You can also see that his right wrist is connected to his hip by a little stone block. That also is a consequence of the heaviness of the stone. The original bronze sculpture by Phidias would have been freestanding and unencumbered by these kinds of stone attachments. The same thing with the statue by Praxiteles of Hermes. You can see that there's this stone bar that connects Praxiteles to um, his his garment, which actually is another clever way of incorporating a support into the statue. What this Greek statuary shows is an extreme self-confidence, a confidence in the human person and in human reason which is unprecedented in human history and the history of art. As the Greeks continued to delve into this humanism, however, they became more interested in the human experience of human emotions, and emotionalism begins to overtake um, the interest in the rational figure. These two sculptures which we're looking at actually mark a break between the high classical period and the late classical period. You can see that in the Praxiteles sculpture on the right, the treatment of the body is slightly less muscular. He's more elongated. His head is smaller in proportion to the rest of his body, which makes him seem much taller. His contrapposto pose is much more exaggerated, which is meant to make him appear more elegant, but he lacks the same kind of vigorous, uh, athletic, and military bearing of the figure on the left, the cannon by Polyclitus, also sometimes called the spear bearer, because just like the Riace bronze, he too would have been holding a spear. After the late Hellenistic period, we see, after the late classical period, we see the rise of what we call Hellenism. And Hellenism is the dispersal of Greek ideas across the Mediterranean world. And this was greatly enhanced by the military actions of Alexander the Great, the Macedonian general who conquered Greece and most of the known world. And when he did so, Alexander spread the Greek language and Greek culture all over the Mediterranean basin. With this, though, comes a greater emphasis on the emotional experience of the statue, of the figure, of the human being. We think about what the Greeks accomplished with their archaic smile, this hinting of an interior life to the statue, an awareness of the emotional dimension of the human experience. And this becomes much more developed in Hellenistic art. Here we're looking at a depiction actually of one of Greece's enemies, a Gallic warrior, And what's interesting about this, though, is that the Greeks are showing empathy, concern, feeling, even for their enemies. And they present them also as being humanized, as being human beings, which is not the way that people normally treat their enemies. In late Hellenistic art, this becomes even more pronounced, this concern for empathy and the human experience. Uh, it also leads the Greeks away from their earlier idealization of the human body. Here we see a depiction of an old woman, and she's haggard and, um, she's haggard and worn out by her hard work, and we can see that she, her body is beginning to sag, and her face is wrinkled. She is not the ideal of human beauty that the Greeks had explored during the classical period, but she's shown with a kind of inner beauty or an inner emotional strength which attracts us to the sculpture. So to recap, I want to reiterate that what we see in the development of Greek statuary is the development of humanism, a development in a rational approach to sculpture, especially which we see in the Phidias, in Phidias's canon, a rational approach to beauty, the idea that beauty can be idealized, but as well as an increasingly emotional awareness of the power of art to express the interior life. All of these aspects of Greek art are evidence of their humanism. Thank you.